Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm excited to have Dr. Adam Locke from Michigan State University on this morning. So he's a professor in the Department of Animal Science, and his extension focuses on animal and human nutrition and how they interface. So if you want to say hi, Adam, and maybe give us a little bit of history of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for the invite. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from a native of Michigan. I've been here since 2009, but I'm from a dairy farm myself, from the southwest of England. My mum and dad have dairy cows. Still have the farm at home there now. But I did my PhD and undergrad at the University of Nottingham in fatty acid digestion, metabolism. Always thought I was going to go home and milk cows with my dad, but one thing led to another, and kind of ended up more in the research area. So I originally came over to the US in 2005 and did a postdoc at Cornell, University of Dr. Bauman. Then my wife and I were in Vermont for a couple of years, and then we moved here in 2009. So I have a research and extension appointment here. So my program's always been in lipid digestion, lipid metabolism of dairy cows. Of course, that's gone down a number of different paths, and probably the last decade now, the applied side of that has been around fatty acid feeding, fat supplementation, looking at maybe how the cow responds best to different fatty acids and fatty acid blends, and recently moved into the oilseed area as well.
Okay. Yeah, I know there's the high oleic beans have been a hot topic, and if we got some time, maybe we'll cover that towards the end. But I just wanted to kind of kick off and talk about lipids, and maybe if you could explain to the producers kind of on a very basic level, like what are fats and how are they differentiated? Because I know there's a lot of if you look at them, like if you look at a tag or something like that, we deal with in the dairy 16 eighths, 16 zeros, 18 zeros, 18 ones, some different types. So can you maybe walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so lipids, fats, oils, to some extent, they all mean the same thing, right? They're mostly triglycerides that contain fatty acids. And I like the term a colleague used a number of years ago. It's the fatty acids within lipids that's the nutritional currency. So if we all remember sort of high school biology, chemistry, fatty acids contain a little more than twice the energy than you can get from a carbohydrate or protein. So with higher and higher production of dairy cows, we have to get more energy into them, more building blocks for milk fat as well. So that's why I think one of the reasons you see increasing interest in fat supplementation is we want to try and get a more energy dense diet to these cows so we can get more nutrients into them. In terms of the individual fatty acids, I think a good analogy that probably many people are aware of in terms of dairy cow diets, where over the last 20 years, we've been making a move away from crude protein to amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
So methionine, lysine, histidine, now we hear about those individual amino acids. More and more now, we're moving away from fat or even ether extracts, from fat to specific fatty acids. So crude protein, amino acids, fats, fatty acids. It's kind of that equivalent. Probably to some extent a little bit simpler on the fatty acid side. There's really only 5 main fatty acids that you find in a typical dairy cow diet. And you mentioned kind of the broad sources earlier. You've got palmitic acid, stearic acid. They're both saturated fatty acids, okay, which we've probably all heard of. Then we have oleic acid, which is a monounsaturated fatty acid, or a MUFA. And then we have linoleic and linolenic, which are polyunsaturates, which are PUFA. And within those two, we hear in the human market a lot now omega 6, omega 3 fatty acids. Linoleic acid is the essential omega 6 fatty acid that all mammals need, and then linolenic is omega 3, and that's the other essential fatty acid. In terms of dietary intake, corn-based diets, corn silage, maize silage, um, corn products, cotton seeds, traditional soybeans, distillers. Linoleic acid is always the major fatty acid in a dairy cow diet because all of those products I mentioned that the lipid there is over 50% linoleic acid. If in certain areas you're feeding more of I call it maybe a green forage based diet, so alfalfa to some extent, but especially your grass based diets, linolenic acid, 18.3 would be the major fatty acid in the diet. You kind of alluded to it earlier on. There's been a lot of interest in the last few years now around palmitic acid, or some people call it a palmitic enriched supplements, or palm fats. That's not quite the best term. These palmitic enriched, and we and others have done a lot of work around those, showing benefits on milk fat production. And of course, with milk fat, milk protein being the main drivers for milk price, there's been a lot of interest in how we can increase production of milk fat. So that's kind of where palmitic acid is a key building block for milk fat in there. So that's kind of a sort of a broad overview there. You mentioned higher leic soybeans earlier on. As their name implies, they're higher leic acids. So traditional soybeans are about 50-55% linoleic acid, not that dissimilar to cottonseed and corn products. Higher leic removes the soybeans, the high leic soybeans removes most of that linoleic acid and it's all replaced with oleic acid. So those higher leic beans are about 80% oleic acid in terms of their fat content. They're about 18-20% fat on a whole bean basis. And we've shown over the last 5 or 6 years some potential beneficial effects of providing cows more oleic acid in terms of fatty acid absorption, and then some beneficial effects, particularly in high producing and early lactation cows. So those two sort of stories have gone hand in hand with some of that now. In terms of the fat supplements, the analogy I would often used is traditionally any fat supplements that have been available are byproducts. Most of our feed ingredients that we feed cows are byproducts of other industries to some extent, aren't they? Like cottonseed, distillers' grains, bakery waste, and the such. So some of those fat supplements in the past, traditional calcium salts, for example, was utilized the first byproduct from palm oil because palms are, very common, cheapest to produce fat sources out there. And then the traditional, saturated enriched supplements came from the saturated fatty acids that were left over when tallow was pressed, or from hydrogenating vegetable oil. So what we've tried to do the last 10 years or so now is ask ourselves, what does the cow benefit most from? Mm. And that's how we got into blending different fat supplements to maybe sort of generate different fatty acid profiles of those. And now the industry have moved, and there's a number of examples in the industry now where they're manufacturing specific fat supplements based off some of that blending work. And so delivering actual fatty acids as bioactive materials or bioactive nutrients rather than just simply an energy source. Because all those fatty acids we talked about all contain about the same energy. But what we're trying to understand now is that each of those fatty acids is going to have different effects in the rumen, small intestine, mammary gland. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So to break it down a little bit, essentially we're dealing with right now, if you don't include the high leic soybeans, we're looking at 4 different fat sources. So typically we'd feed a stearic acid source, a calcium salt type fat, palmitic, and tallow. Can you maybe explain a little bit of difference with those? And maybe kind of talk about the biohydrogenation process, because I know that I think that's where we get into the weeds a little bit with producers is that they don't quite understand, like, not all fat is the same fat. You know, on paper it looks like energy. Like a lot of times our dairy diets are the biggest nutrient that we're looking for when balancing a dairy diet is energy, and but not all energy from fats are created equal.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. This is a good question. Um, big picture, I don't really think of energy as a nutrient. Nutrients supply energy,
Yeah.
so not all that energy is, like you said, is created equal. So there are probably three or four categories of fat supplements that are out there. There's the traditional calcium salts, yeah, and they come typically from palm oil. So they're about equal mixture typically of palmitic acid and oleic acid, simply because that's the profile of palm oil.
Yeah.
Okay, about 40% palmitic, 40 oleic, and going, historically that and saturated prills, so those more stearic enriched prills, they were for a long time the two sources of fat supplements that were out there. And those saturated prills are typically over 50% stearic acid and maybe 30 to 40% palmitic. There's quite a lot of variation in that. Historically, that came from split tallow. Someone pulled off the oleic acid from tallow, and that's kind of what you were left with. You can do the same thing by splitting vegetable oils as well, and that they're available in markets where tallow can't be found. Tallow itself, if people are using that, in heated tanks and the like, that's not that dissimilar in profile to a traditional calcium salt. So palmitic and oleic acid are the major fatty acids. The newest player in that game is the palmitic enriched products.
Yep.
They're typically 80 to 90% palmitic acid, 4 to 8% oleic acid. Again, they were originally on the market because it was a byproduct.
Yeah.
So if you take palm oil, which I said is an equal mixture pretty much of palmitic and oleic, and you split or refine off the oleic that's going into cosmetics, foods, and thousands of other applications in the human market. If you take away nearly all the oleic acid from palm oil, you're basically left with a palmitic enriched product.
Yep.
And that's why it was just coming into the market. And for a lot of times, people wouldn't differentiate between that and a saturated mixed prill with stearic acid because they were both saturated fatty acids. Why would they be any different?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we've been doing a lot more of that research around the benefits of specific fatty acids. Now, tying that into biohydrogenation. Biohydrogenation is basically a term that refers to what rumen bacteria do to unsaturated fatty acids. So one analogy I've always used, if you sort of picture what type of lipid or oil that a cow eats, imagine a bottle of corn oil or a bottle of vegetable oil that something you would have in the kitchen. It's a liquid fat, highly unsaturated. What comes out the mammary gland is butter.
Mm-hmm.
Is more of a saturated fatty acid, and we've moved away from that misperception that saturated fats, butter is bad for you. We're finding a lot more health benefits there. But the reason you see that big difference between vegetable oil and butter is because of biohydrogenation. So unsaturated fatty acids, so primarily linoleic, linolenic, they're to some extent they're toxic to rumen bacteria. So that term biohydrogenation is really just a detoxifying mechanism that allowed bacteria to continue their high growth rates and breakdown of other feeds that are coming in. So the total amount of fatty acids that the cow sees in the small intestine or in her true stomach is pretty much the same as what she's eating. So if she eats 1,000 grams a day, she's going to see 1,000 grams available for absorption. But the profile of that is quite different because you go from a very unsaturated diet to a much more saturated fatty acids that are available. So when you talk about the fat supplements that contain more unsaturated fatty acids, calcium salts, oil seeds, and the like, a lot of that fatty acids will be saturated as they go through the rumen. And so you hear a lot about people talk about rumen protected fats or bypass fats. Most of those terms are somewhat of a misnomer
They're
because
essentially inert.
bacteria,
They're essentially inert, right?
they say that term is inert. It's
Yeah.
kind of a misnomer to some extent because all of those fat sources to some degree will undergo biohydrogenation.
Okay.
The term inertness, when it was first developed around the calcium salt market by Don Palmquist back in the 70s, really meant that that technology, the making a calcium salt, kind of made the fatty acids inert to the bacteria, so you didn't have such a negative effect on the bacteria. We weren't really protecting the fatty acids, it was more protecting the bacteria. And over time, that terminology has kind of got turned around. So most fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids to some degree, are going to undergo biohydrogenation in the rumen, which ultimately results in stearic acid for any of those 18 carbon fatty acids. Now, it's not 100% process. That's why we get some unsaturated fatty acids coming through. But for example, where those fatty acids are within a feed particle or in a fat supplement, how quickly they're available in the rumen, is going to alter that biohydrogenation. So I think a good example of that is if you imagine cottonseed and distiller's grain. You could easily, they've got about the same profile, but I'm much more comfortable feeding a lot of oil from cottonseed than I am from distiller's grains, because that oil's within the seed. The cow, has to, break down that seed coat, and then there's a slow release of oil into the rumen, and the bacteria can handle that much easier than if it's just quickly available from a distiller's grain, for example. So if you go back to the fat supplements now, those palmitic enriched products, they're about, let's say they're 80% palmitic acid. That's a saturated fatty acid.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother the bugs.
So
Okay.
there's no, like, just to kind of break this down in the most simplest terms, like when we're looking at it, like we look at the bond on it. So it's kind of like on a stearic, for instance, could be like an 18-0. So there's 18 carbons and is it carbons and hydrogens? And then when you look at the unsaturated part of it, it's how many bonds are between the two molecules.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a saturated fatty acid basically means all the carbons are saturated with hydrogen.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So then with an unsaturated fatty acid, you've got a couple double bonds between carbons because they don't have all the hydrogens coming off them, kind of
Okay.
thing. So a mono unsaturated, like oleic, has one double bond.
Yeah.
And then a polyunsaturated has two or more. So linoleic has two double bonds, linolenic has three. Go all the way up to EPA and DHA, those long chain omega 3s that have 5 and 6 double bonds.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, what the bacteria are doing in that biohydrogenation term is breaking down those unsaturated double bonds and adding hydrogens
Yeah.
to saturate. Now, of course, if you have, so that's why it doesn't matter what diet you feed a cow, because she sees a lot of oleic, linoleic, linolenic. The major fatty acid that any dairy cow will see in the small intestine is stearic acid.
Okay.
Because it's the end point of biohydrogenation of 18 carbon. And that's another reason why I don't think we need to feed stearic acid within a fat supplement, because she sees a lot of it already, and
They end up there anyways.
they're there anyway from the basal diet. And if I want to get more stearic because it's a good source of energy to the cow, I can do that through other means such as oil seeds. And also, if we focus on palmitic and oleic, for example, in supplemental fats, they're the ones that we can alter the most by supplying more of them.
Okay. Like from the
Yeah.
processing and like before it ever reaches the diet, like.
Well, no, more in terms of most of that stearic that's the cow sees is coming from, basal sources, oil seeds. And I don't think in most situations she doesn't necessarily need more of that. And if you feed it in a fat supplemental fat form, we don't see that good of responses to it. But we can have a better impact on her biology by supplying palmitic and oleic acid in supplemental fat, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So when we talk about amino acids, we talk about limiting amino acids. Is there limiting fatty acids? Like, can you just overfeed? Like, you're only going to get so much of that stearic absorbed if you're overfeeding it, or does it all get absorbed in the small intestine?
It's a good question. Of course, the truly only essential fatty acids to a cow is linoleic and linolenic.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of she cannot no mammal can manufacture them.
Yeah.
Okay, so but in terms of requirements, there are responses to fatty acids
Hmm.
rather than requirements.
And that's why
Um,
we see, like, if you feed palmitic in a diet, we can see an increase
yeah,
in butter fat.
milk fat,
Yeah.
and we think that a lot of that is palmitic acid is the starting point for a lot of triglyceride synthesis in the
Okay.
mammary gland. So she can make palmitic acid herself in the mammary gland from BFAs produced in the rumen, or she can take it up from the diet and circulation. But it seems that in terms of what are some of the best ways to help the mammary gland make more milk fat? Certainly, supply more stearic acid is much, much more beneficial than supplying more stearic acid, for example,
Hmm.
because I think she needs that palmitic to start making milk fat.
Okay.
Um, in terms of responses to, say, stearic acid, for example, like I said, she's always going to see a lot of stearic acid. But what we've seen in our research is that if we feed more stearic acid as a supplemental fat source, we don't see that good a response primarily because we lose digestibility.
Okay.
Because that stearic is just simply coming in as stearic. There's little to no unsaturates with it. And we know that oleic acid, for example, can really help improve fatty acid absorption. But if you're not, so with an oil seed, to take cottonseed, for example, most of that is going to be available to the cow as stearic ultimately after biohydrogenation. But there's still going to be, let's say, 10 to 20% of that was fed that's going to reach the small intestine as unsaturated fatty acids, which is going to help the absorption of that additional stearic acid. So,
Mhm.
for example, we fed a stearic enriched product in the past, and we did like total tract digestible energy, bond calorimetry. And just because you feed a more energy dense diet doesn't necessarily mean the cow's going to get more energy
Okay.
if digestibility drops away. The other interesting one with palmitic acid, and this isn't really captured in nutrition models, or I don't think you can necessarily measure it on farm, is we very consistently see improvements in fiber digestibility
That's interesting.
when we feed palmitic acid, which ultimately can then also maybe help improve VFA supply to the mammary gland as well. So we see maybe a 3.5 to 4.5% improvement in total tract NDF digestibility when we feed palmitic acid. And there's some data coming out now, some of other people's labs, that there's probably in terms of enhancing or improving the efficiency of bacterial growth, particularly for those fiber digesters in the rumen.
Like, what's your, I guess, antiquated thoughts on that?
But I think the simplest way that I've had to try and understand it, because I'm not a microbiologist, is she's probably able to utilize that palmitic acid available in the rumen from the diet in terms of cell membranes and growth easier than making it herself from smaller building blocks in terms of what the bacteria are doing themselves. So maybe it's helping to promote, you know, more fiber digesters or increasing the turnover rate of fiber digesters. So, there's a lot of, very basic science underpinning all of that. But from a whole animal cow level, very consistent improvements in NDF digestibility.
Would I be crazy to think that, like, we know that sugar is very important in creating the rumen microbes that break down fiber? Like, would it be like because it's energy sparing? Like, if we're feeding palmitic, like higher palmitic acid, some of that sugar, I guess, wouldn't be used to biohydrogenate a fat source, so it's getting used to build fiber digestion bugs.
I think that energy sparing probably is a good way to think about that. We actually have some interest in that whole starch sugar area now in terms of promoting more fiber digesters, which ultimately leads to more acetate production.
Hmm.
But I think that sort of energy sparing, it's more efficient for a bacteria to take up preformed palmitic than it is to make it herself. Yeah, that's how I've tried to understand it. And from the actual mechanisms, I'm not very accurate with that. But that's from a farm level, that's a very consistent response, and we don't see that, for example, with stearic acid.
Now there is a little bit of talk too about reproductive improvements when feeding different fat sources. Like, is there any research to back up the fact that, like, if you feed more stearic, for instance, you could see higher conception rates, or does it go back to like your oleic or linoleic, or like how does that
Yeah. So, if you look back over the whole body of the data in general, I think people have said when you feed supplemental fat, you can see some improvements in repro.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you start to break that down, it's more probably with some of the unsaturated fat sources. And there's a lot more interest now in the omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids. So I think there's a lot of interest in biology on the omega-3 side, because that's, especially on corn-based diets, that's the fatty acid she sees the least of. And we actually just published some papers recently about, how good ruminants are at conserving those that they see because they want to use them themselves. So I think, is that truly from a reproductive benefit, or is it maybe from a animal health benefit that leads to better reproduction? That's kind of an open question.
The chicken and egg.
There. Yeah. So, some people, I've seen some data, maybe saturated fat source, the traditional stearic ones could improve or reduce body weight loss in that early lactation. We have some data from a few years ago that showed that, but you then also have to balance that up with milk production. To some extent, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul there to some extent.
Yeah. Okay.
So we did, when we fed a stearic, saturated traditional source, we did reduce body condition and body weight loss quite a bit, but they peaked at about 10 pounds less milk.
Okay.
So, you have to weigh those up. With palmitic acid, we have a very interesting early lactation from calving all the way out to about 8 weeks of lactation. And in that first 3 weeks, they lost about 20 kilos more body weight than they half kilos more milk, energy corrected milk per day.
Yeah.
So, our farm's not big enough to look at repro effects, but, there's been some interest around, does palmitic acid feeding in early lactation reduce impact body weight loss? In that one study, we did lose a bit more body weight. And that's really where we got interested in the palmitic and oleic acid blends. We have data now that if we reduce the amount of palmitic in a product and bring in a bit more oleic acid, we can still get those milk production responses, but she doesn't lose additional body weight to support them. So, that's probably from improved absorption and improved NDF digestibility and some partitioning. So that's where you sometimes you hear about like this 60-30 blend now, or 70-20, where we have really good data that if you feed a fat blend that's like 2/3 palmitic, 1/3 oleic, roughly 60-30, that's kind of where we've seen some good effects, where we can get production and benefits in early fresh cows without losing additional body weight.
What stage is the research on some of these in getting to commercial products? Like, I know we typically see like your palmitic or your straight stearics and things like that. Like, is there a lot more products, I guess, coming down the pipeline where we're looking more at some of these blends?
Well, I know of 3 or 4 different sources of calcium salts now that are like a 60-30 or a 70-20 blend. But I probably know of more nutritionists that are taking traditional, like say a traditional palmitic enriched and a traditional calcium salt or palm oil, and blending them together in certain ratios to get that type of blend. Some of that depends on how many fats a farm can carry or what the mills have and some of that. But that's where if I was making recommendations right now, I'd be looking at, in an early and high lactation group, I'd be doing like a 60-30 blend of palmitic and oleic, and then in mid and late lactation, I would be doing like a palmitic enriched product, because we can get more milk fat yield, and we don't necessarily want to see additional body weight gain
Mhm.
in a later lactation cow.
Well, I heard that too about, and I haven't really tried it yet, but feeding palmitic in late lactation. Usually we don't do it because of expense. Like if we're feeding a low group, we're trying to reduce milk and all these other things. But I've heard
Mm-hmm.
with controlling body condition in late lactation, you're actually better to feed a palmitic source, because you don't necessarily put all that body weight back on the animal.
Yeah,
It goes out in the milk tank.
yeah. Well, and then a lot of people think a maintenance group or a low group, you should drop fat, whereas I think it's this the starch reduction in starch is probably much more important.
Well, and that's kind of what I go out to, because if you look at what we
Yeah,
try and do with a feedlot animal is you increase the starch as their life cycle gets closer to finishing, right? So you put more weight.
yeah,
So it's kind of
yeah,
backwards thinking, like to increase the starch in a late lactation diet, just because you will see higher body condition gains.
yeah. Well, it's a bit like in humans, right? There's a lot of us that carry too much body weight, and it's
Yeah.
mostly from
Mostly from
highly processed
carbohydrate. Yeah.
foods, not necessarily from fats, right?
Yeah. No, I just thought that was really interesting. And then one thing too that I kind of maybe something I've thought about with feeding calcium salts is I think there was some work, and I'm not sure, maybe you had done it on improved feed efficiency when feeding calcium salt.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, so feed efficiency is a term often used. I think one of my colleagues that does a lot of work in that area prefers that sort of milk to feed ratio. So if you look
Yeah.
at energy corrected milk over dry matter intake.
Yeah.
Um, so with a traditional calcium salt, typically you will see an improvement in that metrics because you often see more energy corrected milk, and she often eats a little bit less. So in a majority of situations, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In
No.
an early lactation cow, you probably don't want her to eat less. And then so with palmitic enriched products, and then with our palmitic oleic blends, we don't really see reductions in intake like you would with a traditional calcium. So my Jose, one of my postdocs here, Dos Santos Neto, he did a big meta-analysis on traditional calcium salts a couple of years ago. Um, and across that whole picture, we typically saw about half a kilo drop in intake with a traditional calcium salt, but improvements in milk production.
Yeah. Is that just because of palatability?
No, I don't think so. That's often thrown out
Because
there as that
they do
because of the
stink.
smell, right? But
Yeah.
I don't think it's that. I think it's actually some of the oleic acid at certain
Okay.
levels can maybe drop intake, or unsaturated fatty acids can actually impact gut peptides, gut hormones.
Okay.
I really don't think it's a palatability thing
Wow. Because I know
personally.
like I've done this in the past with people that have never fed calcium salts before. We always start at either a low rate or even just take a bag in the barn and open it up so they get used to that smell, because we have seen it where
Yeah,
you put them on full dose right away, like intake will back off for 3 or 4 days,
yeah,
get hungry and get eating again, right? So
yeah, yeah.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about high oleic soybeans. I know that's kind
Hmm.
of a emerging topic in the upper Midwest, at least, which we are here. We're in Southern Ontario. So, um, can you kind of maybe give us a little bit of a breakdown on what the high oleic soybeans mean? I know you already kind of started that with the linoleic versus oleic, but
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the only difference really is the total fat content's the same in conventional and higher lake beans, around that 18 to 20% fat in a bean. But the difference is you go from about a 55% linoleic acid in a conventional bean to about 75-80% oleic acid in the higher lake bean, and there's two or three sources out there now. Some are GM. I know that there's some naturally bred higher lake. They're not quite as high in a lake. Um, Before we even did any work on them ourselves, I would have said from a risk of low milk fat or milk fat depression. going from the conventional to a higher lake would have been a no-brainer anyway,
Yeah.
because oleic acid is a lot lower risk for milk fat depression than linoleic
Yeah.
because the number of double bonds, right? But where we got more interested was there was a couple of producers starting to wanting to feed them here, so we were getting questions from nutritionists. Then the other part of it there was, um, we could grow these higher lake beans here in Michigan. Basically, they can potentially could represent a very good source of protein,
Yep.
obviously, but also homegrown fat,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and
So
like
could
fat is expensive, and it doesn't seem to
yeah,
be getting any cheaper. So like we have
no,
ebbs and flows in the market, but there seems to be more ebbs than flows lately. So,
yeah. So I think there's a lot of interest in the dairy industry in areas where soybeans have traditionally been grown.
yeah.
So like you said, the Midwest, New York, there's a lot of interest in these beans now, and that's producers that maybe have their own land base, but also now I'm hearing of dairy producers wanting soybean growers to grow them for them.
Yeah.
So we've done five. We're probably on our sixth and seventh studies right now with higher lake beans. We did, and a lot of that work that we've done here has been supported by internal funding mechanism through MSU in conjunction with the dairy industry and the state government, this Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture. So they've helped support that, and then the Soybean Council have helped support that, and I get a lot of industry support locally. So we initially did a dose response study.
Yep.
How much could we feed? And then the other key one right early on was roasted versus raw.
Yeah.
And so both of those studies have been published now. And then the next couple pieces of work we did was if we're going to utilize these beans, maybe what other changes in the diet should we make to best utilize them? So, and our interest is around milk fat. So we've been looking at with and without palmitic acid, and then what happens if we can get more acetate produced in the rumen. And right now, Kirsten, one of my PhD students, she's feeding them during the transition period. So 3 weeks before calving, 3 weeks after calving. That one's going to be very interesting,
Well,
especially with that oleic acid piece there.
yeah, because it's like I think there is a benefit to probably feeding omega-3s prepartum, right?
Also, early postpartum, there is some
Yeah.
data on that.
Yeah.
For me, the jury's still a little bit out on that. So,
Yeah.
but remember, oleic acid isn't an omega
Or
three.
sorry, 6, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, personally, I think the dairy cow certainly on a high corn-based diet, she probably has enough linoleic acid personally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interest now actually around the benefits of oleic acid, which is an omega-9, if you look at the human literature on some of that. So we're interested. Kirsten's going to do some more work looking at maybe some health indices or immunology type parameters there. But one of the going back to sort of that big picture with the higher oleic beans is a couple of things there. I think we can economically feed more or higher fat diets
Yeah.
to cows than if you were just looking to feed a supplemental fat. And they can also replace some other supplemental fats in the diet. I don't agree with comments I've heard that says you can take out all other fat sources for supplemental fat. We have data to show that if you have higher oleic beans in the diet, she's going to respond better with some palmitic still in the diet.
Mhm.
But you could replace all like traditional calcium salts, I think, and then certainly stearic acid and rich prills. They could all be replaced by the beans. But we can also feed higher fat diets, which is going to help meet energy needs of higher and higher producing dairy cows.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of benefits there. And then that roasting raw, absolutely, our data would support roasting and
Yeah.
grinding the higher oleic beans.
Yeah.
Um,
Which you would never do with like traditional beans. Like it was like you might flake them, but you wouldn't grind them.
Well, people did roast and grind, but you couldn't feed the levels that we're feeding now
Yeah.
because you could easily drop milk fat or
Yeah.
crash milk fat. We even fed them up to 24% of the diet and still
Really?
got improvements in milk fat. Yeah. I'm not recommending that. That basically had to replace every other protein source in the diet. But we've done a bunch of studies now at 16%, and now we're in that 12 to 10 to 12% dry matter range in terms of what's realistically feasible on farms.
Yeah, and that's still quite substantial then.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about feeding them as a forage?
Oh, I don't know. I don't have any.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
there enough forage material in them at harvest time, or you'd harvest them at an earlier time?
Uh, so I've had producers grow soybeans as a forage source, and typically they would do it, when the bottom, this isn't very technical, but when the bottom starts to yellow off, what they would do is they would cut them, leave them for 3 days, and then chop them and put them in the silo. And it had a really interesting analysis on paper because it looked like corn silage with the energy levels, fiber levels, but then it had 19% protein to it. Like the energy was, we're looking at 1.7 megacal per kilo. So I was very scared because the fat was high on it. But then when the cows went on it, it just never, they never skipped a beat. So I thought, well, what's going on here? Because on paper, this should be a train wreck right now. But
yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, it's hard for me to get my head around that on a dry matter basis, the energy would be the same as corn silage. I guess with the starch versus
it came from fat,
I guess
right?
it kind of
Just instead of starch.
yeah. No, so I guess that makes sense. I mean, I don't know what sort of structural for is there much forage NDF in that? I'm not too sure, but from a response on the protein and the oil side, I'd imagine you're not going to get as much bypass protein
No,
from that.
I can't remember
From rumen undegradable
Yeah,
protein, you wouldn't get as much of that from a fermented than you would roasted. For us, there was at least a couple kilo benefit to roasting them versus feeding them raw.
yeah. So Adam, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know we're in a little bit of a time crunch here, and I want to be respective of that. But we definitely covered a lot of things this morning. Would there be any kind of message that you wanted to leave with producers when they're looking at different fat sources and things like that on farm when they're making those decisions?
Yeah, and let's sort of kind of work backwards there. There's a lot of emerging data now around high oleic soybeans, which I think has a lot of benefits. But also, I'd say don't forget about the potential of cottonseed as well, whole cottonseed. There's a lot of good data now in high producing cows that some decent levels of whole cottonseed in the diet can have good responses. And similarly, that's less expensive, hopefully, source of added fat than a supplemental fat source. So there's that oilseed piece, and there's a lot of interest re-emerging in that. On that supplemental fat source, of course, as you said, they can be expensive, and especially with shipping and the like. So you want to be very prudent on targeting what you're feeding. Mm-hmm. So a simple term, I gave like a 2-hour seminar in Australia a number of years ago now about some of our work, different fatty acids, and one person summarized it by basically saying, "Oh, so a bag of fat's not a bag of fat." I'm like, well, yeah, I guess that's the take home.
Very simplistic.
So, yeah, very simplistic. But fat isn't fat.
Yeah.
So next time someone comes to sell you a fat supplement, number one question is, what's the fatty acid profile?
Yep.
And then total fat content. That's the two things that are going to drive what response and what value it might have to you. Based off our data, I would be recommending a sort of a blend, a palmitic and oleic acid blends, and that depends on what your needs are to some extent, or a palmitic enriched product. I wouldn't be looking at stearic enriched products based off what we have. Much better off utilizing oil seeds in that situation. But the oleic acid story and the palmitic acid story are pretty solid now in that milk production area.
Well, I truly appreciate it, Adam, and I hope you enjoy the cold weather because I don't you'd get this kind of weather in Nottingham.
Not in England, no. It's funny when you compare those temperatures. Of course, it's a damper cold at home.
Yeah,
a real dry cold here.
Yeah. No.
Appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Wallenstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoy the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.